In today's video, we're gonna talk about the whole timeline of the civil rights movement from the very beginning to the end.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight.
First of all, what is the civil rights movement? The American Civil Rights Movement was a political movement and campaign that started in 1954 till 1968 in the United States to abolish institutional racial segregation and discrimination throughout the United States. Starting off with the first main event in May 17, 1954, the case of Brown versus Board of Education. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark decision of the U.S. Supreme Court in which the court ruled that U.S. state laws establishing racial segregation in public schools are unconstitutional, even if the segregated schools are otherwise equal in quality. Moving on to the next main event and one of the most famous events in the civil rights movement was the Montgomery bus boycott in December 1, 1955. The Montgomery bus boycott was a political and social protest campaign against the policy of racial segregation on public transit system of Montgomery, Alabama. It was a foundational event in the civil rights movement in the United States. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man. Her actions sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, which was organized by local black community leaders. Lasting 381 days, the Montgomery bus boycott resulted in the Supreme Court ruling segregation on public buses unconstitutional. A significant play towards civil rights and transit equity, the Montgomery bus boycott helped eliminate early barriers to transportation access.
September 4, 1957. In 1957, the Little Rock Nine were a group of 9 African American students at Little Rock Central High School. They were blocked from integrating the school. Their enrollment was followed by the Little Rock Crisis, in which Governor Orville Forbes of Arkansas originally prohibited the kids from joining the racially segregated school. February 1, 1960.
I did not believe for 1 minute that I was a second-class citizen, that I was inferior in any way to whites, greens, whatever.
Young African American student staged a sit-in at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, 1960, and refused to leave after being denied service. The sit-in movement quickly expanded across the South college cities, despite the fact that many of the demonstrators were detained for trespassing, disorderly behavior, or disturbing the peace. Their activities had an immediate and enduring impact, pushing Woolworths and other businesses to amend its segregationist policies.
August 1963, March on Washington, one of the most admired, popular, and dominant civil rights movements.
200,000 people converge on the nation's capital to rally for civil rights. They come united in one cause.
One day right now in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys.
In 1963, civil rights leaders held a political demonstration in Washington, D.C. to protest racial discrimination and show support for major civil rights legislation. The March on Washington was a massive protest march that occurred in August 1963 when some 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., also known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. This event intended to draw attention to the inequalities and challenges that African Americans face a century after emancipation. It was also occasion of Martin Luther King Jr. now iconic I Have a Dream speech. March 7, 1965, Bloody Sunday, where police, state troopers, and citizens violently attacked civil rights marchers attempting to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, United States. And this March of this year, demonstrators marching 54 miles from Selma to Montgomery the state of capital were met with a little violence from local authorities and white vigilant groups in an attempt to register black voters in the South. The ministers, who were protected by Federal National Guard troops, finally achieved their aim, walking around the clock for 3 days to reach Montgomery, Alabama. As the world watched this historic march, which included Martin Luther King Jr., raised awareness of the challenges that black voters face, the necessity of National Voting Rights Act.
Okay, moving on to the next point. August 6, 1965. Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson, is considered one of the most far-reaching pieces of civil rights legislation in US history. During the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, voting rights activists in the South was subjected to various forms of mistreatment and violence. The president discussed the destructive methods used to deny African Americans the right to vote. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law on August 6, 1965, with Martin Luther King Jr. and the other civil rights leaders were present at the ceremony. Now moving on to 1968. April 4, 1968. Assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, on the balcony of his hotel room in 1969. James Earl Ray was found guilty of the murder.
News of King's assassination prompted major outbreaks of racial violence, resulting in more than 40 deaths nationwide and extensive property damage in over 100 American cities. James Earl Ray, a 40-year-old escaped fugitive, later confessed to the crime and was sentenced to a 99-year prison term. During King's funeral, a tape recording was played in which King spoke of how he wanted to be remembered after his death. He said, "I'd like somebody to mention that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others." I hope you enjoyed our video and learned more about civil rights movements.
Thank you for listening.